Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels of the New Testament. While we don't know who wrote these Gospels, one thing we do know is that three of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, look very similar to each other. Sometimes they share word-for-word agreement. What's that all about? Did the Gospel writers copy from each other? If you'd like to learn more about this topic, this is a collaboration with Matt over at Useful Charts. Click the link in the comments below to watch his video. Scholars call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic comes from the Greek syn, meaning together, and opsis, having to do with view or sight. Thus, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptic because, in distinction from John, they can be viewed together. That is, these three Gospels look more or less the same. First of all, the synoptics tell many of the same stories. Jesus' temptation, his exorcisms, parables, and transfiguration, Jesus cursing a fig tree, his Last Supper with his disciples, and his prayer in Gethsemane. These are all found in all three synoptic Gospels, but many of these stories are not found in John. In fact, almost every story in Mark is also found in Matthew or Luke. In contrast, most of the stories in John are not found in the Synoptic Gospels. For example, the story of Jesus visiting the Pharisee Nicodemus is only found in John. So we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke synoptic because, unlike John, they tell the same stories. But there's an even more important sense in which the Synoptic Gospels can be said to look the same. When Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the same story, they tell it in the very same words. Consider the call of Levi, a story found in all three Synoptic Gospels. In the original Greek of Mark, this passage is 20 words long, and almost every single one of those 20 words from Mark also appears in Matthew and Luke. This is not an isolated occurrence. There are extended word-for-word agreements between the synoptics in almost every shared story. Consider another example, the feeding of the 5,000. Once again, all three synoptics use the same words to tell the same story. And the feeding of the 5,000 is an especially interesting example because it's one of the rare stories that appears in both the Synoptics and the Gospel of John. But unlike the Synoptics, John does not share any wording. The fourth Gospel tells the story in its own language. So the sheer fact that John is so different highlights the special relationship among the Synoptics. The Synoptics tell most of the same stories. John, for the most part, tells different stories. The Synoptics share a great deal of language among themselves. John does not. In fact, according to one tabulation, 77% of Mark's precise wording appears in Matthew, and 61% of Mark's wording appears in Luke. So all this to say, these Gospels are extremely similar. So, were the authors of the Synoptic Gospels copying from one another? Well, saying yes contradicts the traditional and still popular origin story of the Gospels. Christian tradition going back to the 2nd century attributes Matthew to a guy named Matthew, a disciple of Jesus. According to this tradition, Matthew wrote his Gospel in Hebrew. The Gospel according to Mark, on the other hand, was a compilation of Peter's recollections composed by John Mark in Rome. Last of all, Luke was written by a traveling companion of Paul. Matthew and Luke, according to this traditional picture, were composed in different languages, based on the memories of two different disciples of Jesus. This popular tradition of the Gospel origins assumes that they were independent. However, today, New Testament scholars universally recognize that the Gospel writers were copying each other, what scholars call a literary or documentary solution to the synoptic problem. That's to say, the Gospel writers must have been sitting in front of documents and copying from them when they were writing their own Gospels. What makes scholars so sure? First of all, as we've discussed thus far, there is the sheer quantity of the verbatim agreement between the Synoptic Gospels. There is, for instance, a 27-word string of verbatim agreement between Matthew and Luke, which you can see here on screen. This appears in a speech given by Jesus in Matthew chapter 11 and Luke chapter 10. Here the synoptics present Jesus' teaching with the exact same words in the exact same order. It strains believability that two authors would independently report Jesus' teaching with the exact same 27 words in a row. Again, this example is not unique. There's a 64-word passage in the preaching of John the Baptist where Matthew and Luke differ by only 3 or 4 words. And there are dozens of other examples like this. These kind of agreements between the synoptics are even more remarkable when we remember that Jesus taught in Aramaic, not Greek. It is simply not plausible that two authors working independently would translate Jesus' Aramaic into Greek in precisely the same way. Verbatim agreements between the synoptics are not restricted to reported speech either. The synoptic evangelists also narrate events and describe settings with the same words. Consider, for instance, Judas's betrayal of Jesus in the garden. Here, Matthew and Mark describe Judas's actions in the very same language. To summarize, the verbatim agreement between the synoptic gospels indicates that the gospel writers were copying from each other. When the later gospel writers, whichever ones they were, began to compose their own gospel, they had a copy of the earlier synoptic gospel in front of them. In writing their own gospels, then, they copied extensively out of their literary predecessor. The popular picture of four independent evangelists writing their own gospels based on their own independent sources of tradition is simply not sustainable based on the evidence. So if we know they were copying, from whom were they copying? Alongside the documentary solution to the synoptic problem, the most broadly accepted tenet in the study of the synoptic gospels is that Mark was first, or to use the scholarly jargon, Markan priority. Markan priority is the supposition that Mark was written first, and according to virtually all scholars working on the synoptic problem today, the authors of Matthew and Luke copied extensively from Mark's gospel. Why do scholars think this? First, the idea that Matthew and Luke used Mark is more plausible than the alternative, that Mark used Matthew and Luke. That is, based on everything we know about first century Christians in these Gospels, it's easy to understand why someone would write Matthew or Luke if they had a copy of Mark in front of them. But it's very difficult to understand why someone would write Mark if they had a copy of either Matthew or Luke in front of them. This is sometimes described as the argument from the implausibility of Mark's redaction profile. Redaction is the name New Testament scholars give to the changes an author makes to their source while composing a new version of a story. A work's redaction profile is the tendencies reflected across the various changes made by an author. In other words, it's their editorial process and their editorial decision-making. One major problem with the idea that Mark was written after the other synoptic gospels is that the redaction profile of Mark, on that supposition, is difficult to understand based on everything we know about first century Christianity. Okay, so hypothetically, put yourself in the mind of Mark. You're sitting there, writing your gospel, and you are handed a copy of the Gospel of Luke. The story of Jesus' birth is found only in Luke and Matthew, not Mark. So in this hypothetical situation, you, the gospel writer, would be reading through Luke and then decide to cut Jesus' origin story. That doesn't make much sense. Likewise, we know that the author of Mark believed that Jesus appeared to his disciples after his resurrection. Jesus predicts it in Mark 14, verse 28. But at the end of Mark's gospel, it just ends abruptly. The women at the tomb run away because they're afraid. So in this scenario, you would read through some really interesting post-resurrection appearances to his disciples and then decide to delete that. Why would Mark conclude his gospel without including those stories? And it's important to note that this is not reversible. It makes all the sense in the world why Luke, reading a copy of Mark, would make the additions that he did. You would read through Mark and be like, whoa, where is the birth story? Where are the post-resurrection appearances to his disciples? I better add to this in my own version. This is only the first line of evidence that supports Markan priority. It's quite easy to understand how and why a first century Christian with a copy of Mark would write Matthew or Luke. Christians were interested in Jesus' birth and resurrection, so they would take a copy of Mark and add to it. But it's not clear why any Christian in the first century with a copy of Matthew in front of them would produce Mark. Why delete the miraculous nativity and appearances of the resurrected Jesus? The redaction profile of Mark, his editorial decision-making, is hard to explain if we suppose Mark was composed later. The redaction profile of Matthew and Luke, given Markan priority, is perfectly clear. Another line of evidence for Markan priority is the way that the Synoptic Gospels agree with one another when they are telling the same story. Stories that are found in all three Synoptics are called triple tradition. So for instance, Jesus' parable of the sower and the transfiguration story are triple traditions. There's a pattern of evidence in triple tradition stories that supports Markan priority when considered alongside ancient writing practices. Specifically, Mark in the triple tradition is usually the middle term. Now, what do I mean by middle term? This means when it comes to triple tradition stories, that Matthew often agrees with Mark, and Luke also often agrees with Mark. But Matthew and Luke seldom agree with each other unless they also agree with Mark. So the middle term, or the common denominator of the synoptics, is Mark. So we have two scenarios, one more likely than the other. This means that either Matthew and Luke each drew on Mark, or Mark somehow interwove Matthew and Luke within each story. But that latter theory is unlikely based on research on ancient editorial practices. Ancient authors did not really do that kind of editing. They did not engage in the kind of micro-conflation that would be required to produce Mark on the basis of weaving together Matthew and Luke. A third and final piece of evidence for Markan priority is the phenomenon of editorial fatigue. In an important article by the New Testament scholar Mark Goodacre argues that the authors of Matthew and Luke sometimes grow fatigued in their rewriting of Mark. By this he means these writers will make changes to Mark at the beginning of a story, but then lapse back into copying directly out of Mark as the story goes on. On a couple of occasions, this phenomenon results in inconsistencies in the rewritten version of the story. For example, the feeding of the 5,000, according to Mark, took place in a deserted place by themselves. In the middle of the story, the disciples say to Jesus, "This is a deserted place," and they suggest that Jesus send the people into the surrounding country and villages to get food. But the Gospel of Luke relocates this event to Bethsaida, a major fishing village, not the desert, and definitely not a deserted place. But as the story goes on, the author of Luke reproduces the disciples' statement, "For we are here in a deserted place." In this context, however, it does not make sense for the disciples to claim that they are in a deserted place or to speak of surrounding villages. Presumably, they should be in Bethsaida, like Luke said at the beginning of the story. So it seems that Luke lapsed back into copying his source material and created a narrative inconsistency. There are several examples of editorial fatigue in Matthew and Luke that resulted from their use of Mark. There are no counterexamples of fatigue in Mark that resulted from their use of a narrative as found in Matthew or Luke. This strongly suggests that Matthew and Luke drew upon Mark as a documentary source when composing their gospel. Markan priority explains a great deal of the synoptic data. The redaction profile of Matthew and Luke fits in the world of first century Christianity. The pattern of agreement in the triple tradition makes sense on the supposition that the authors of Matthew and Luke drew on Mark as the common denominator. And the phenomenon of editorial fatigue is explained by the latter synoptic gospel writers using Mark. Scholars therefore conclude that the authors of Matthew and Luke copied significant portions of their Gospels directly from a copy of Mark. However, there's a big data point here that remains unexplained by Markan priority, the so-called double tradition. There are about 220 verses of high word-for-word agreement between Matthew and Luke, without any parallel in Mark. Since this material was not copied out of Mark, how is it that Matthew and Luke agree word for word? The answer to this question remains one of the biggest controversies in New Testament studies. Most scholars belong to one of two schools of thought, and the field is fairly neatly divided in two. One popular explanation is called the two-source theory. This was the majority position for much of the 20th century. As the name suggests, the two-source theory argues that Matthew and Luke drew independently on two different sources, Mark and a now lost source called Q. Q here is short for Quelle, the German word for source. According to this theory, the double tradition are those places where the synoptic gospel writers used Q instead of Mark. On the basis of this double tradition, scholars have attempted detailed reconstructions of this lost Q source. The other school of thought is called the Farrer hypothesis, named after Oxford theologian Austin Farrer. Instead of positing a hypothetical source, the Farrer hypothesis proposes that the author of Luke used both Mark and Matthew. In the triple tradition, where Mark is the middle term, the authors of Matthew and Luke used Mark. In the double tradition, where Matthew and Luke agree without any parallel in Mark, the author of Luke used Matthew. There are a series of arguments for and against both of these positions, which we'll need to save for a future video. But it's worth remembering just how much these two rival schools of thought agree. First, both the two-source theory and the Farrer hypothesis agree on the need for a documentary solution to the synoptic problem. The extensive word-for-word agreements between the synoptics cannot be explained by shared memory or oral tradition. Second, the two-source theory and the Farrer hypothesis agree that Mark came first. The authors of Matthew and Luke must have used a copy of Mark in the composition of their own Gospels. These two insights are uncontroversial in New Testament scholarship, and they're fundamental to current research on the Gospels and even reconstructing the life of Jesus. So, what can the synoptic problem tell us about who wrote the Gospels? Well, it doesn't tell us the evangelists' names, their birth dates, or their hair colors, but it does tell us a few important things. For example, the fact that the author of Matthew copied the origin story of the disciple named Matthew word for word out of Mark probably means that Matthew himself did not write the gospel named for him. Why would a disciple of Jesus need a written source for Jesus' ministry? And for that matter, who needs to plagiarize their own biography? In other words, Matthew was not written by one of Jesus' disciples. Furthermore, an approach to the Gospels called redaction criticism gives us some insight into the ideology of the synoptic Gospel writers. Redaction criticism studies how Matthew and Luke changed Mark. Why did they delete this? Why did they change that? What did they rewrite? The answers to these questions can tell us what the authors were interested in. While parts of the synoptic problem remain controversial, the basic insights of this subfield of study have already illuminated our understanding of the synoptic Gospels. If you'd like to learn more about the Gospels, then head on over to Useful Charts, an amazing educational YouTube channel where you can learn more about who wrote the Bible. Link in the description below. Thanks, everyone.